Hey, Mr. Zook's class, we're going to continue on with the book scavenger. Thursday morning, Halloween, Emily got to school extra early. The hallways were nearly empty. Two teachers Emily didn't know stopped talking as she walked by. One was dressed in a striped red shirt, matching knit hat, and round black glasses, raised his hand in greeting, and the woman, dressed as a mad scientist, added morning. Emily rounded a corner, passing the papier-mâché witch hats decorated by sixth graders that lined the windows of the library. She studied every student in the halls, wondering if one might be Babbage. A boy wearing a panda hat and a Giants jersey, two girls with cat ear headbands and their faces painted with whiskers. Room 40 was where she and James had social studies with Mr. Quinsley, so she shouldn't have been surprised when she stepped inside to see him there grading papers, but she was. Oh, Emily stepped backwards. I was supposed to meet a student here. Mr. Quinsley set down his pen. He hadn't dressed for the holiday. Shirley Wombat? For a moment, she thought he was asking if that was the student she was meeting. Finally, she understood he was asking if she was Shirley Wombat. You're Babbage? She knew adults played book scavenger, but she didn't think that meant teachers. At your service, his eyes flicked down to her t-shirt, then back up. He cracked a smile. Boo to you too, he said. Emily's face warmed. I wasn't sure if kids dress up for Halloween or not. Mr. Quinsley nodded. Clever, subtle. I like it. So you have a question about a cipher? His eyes narrowed. This isn't one of the submissions for class, is it? No, Emily said. It's not for school. It's just something I was working on in my own time. This seemed to satisfy Mr. Quinsley. Let's take a look. Emily set her backpack on his desk and unzipped it to pull out her notebook. Before she laid a hand inside, Mr. Quinsley cleared his throat. That isn't the book I think it is, I hope. Oh, why didn't she think before opening her backpack? The gold bug sat prominently on top of her notebook. She'd completely forgotten she'd told Mr. Quinsley she'd hidden it through Book Scavenger and would try to retrieve it. As casually as possible, she shifted the book deeper into her backpack while she removed her notebook. I've already seen it. There's no use trying to hide it, Mr. Quinsley said. It will be much worse if you lie to me. You can trust me on that. Reluctantly, Emily said, It is that Poe book. I am giving it back. Soon. Mr. Quinsley's mouth formed a thin, tight line. He wiggled his jaw as if he were grinding something between his teeth. His next words came out, very slowly. You did hear me say someone's job was on the line for that book. A man could be fired if he doesn't have it. Yes, Emily said. She couldn't meet Mr. Quinsley's gaze. From the moment she met him, she'd been on his bad side. He must have a very different idea of what kind of person she actually was. Let me get this straight. You would rather a man lose his job so you can keep a book. With every word Mr. Quinsley said, Emily shrank an inch. I wasn't going to keep it. Mr. Quinsley held up a hand to stop her and then turned a palm up. Give me the book. She had to make him understand. Mr. Quinsley is not what you think. Before Mr. Quinsley cut her off, she rushed on. It's Mr. Griswold's next game, and I can prove it. Chapter 32. Mr. Quinsley dropped his hand on the desk and didn't say anything. Emily wasn't sure if that meant he was surprised or not. Mr. Quinsley's expressions were like a closet of pressed gray suits. All pulled together, all professional, all respectable. But it was hard to tell from day to day if the gray suit he wore was the same or different from the one the day before. She flipped open the gold bug to the Bayside Press symbol that had a raven in place of a seagull. "This was my first clue," she said, "and then I found a secret message in the story. Mr. Griswold made this book with typos intentionally left inside. If you find the typos and list all the correct letters in one line, it spells the first sentence of another Edgar Allan Poe story." Mr. Quincy picked up the book and flipped through it as Emily recounted the rest of the scavenger hunt so far. "And now I'm stumped with the clue I found in the Maltese Falcon. That's what I thought you could help me with." She reached for her backpack to grab the book, but Mr. Quincy held up his hand. "I don't want to see it, Emily, but you could help me figure it out. We could work on the game together, and once we get to the end, then we could give the book back. I've been planning on giving it back all along. If I look at your newly found puzzle, I'm sure I will want to solve it, which is why I don't want to see it." Mr. Quincy sighed. "I've met him, you know, Mr. Griswold." He patted the gold bug. "Then you should understand better than anyone," Emily pleaded. "People are saying he might—" Emily ducked her head, focusing on Mr. Quincy's desk. She couldn't say the words. She had stopped checking for updates on how Mr. Griswold was doing because she was afraid the news would be bad. He would want his game played. He would want me to finish. Emily didn't look up, afraid Mr. Quincy wouldn't get it, just as James didn't. "You're probably right, Emily," Mr. Quincy said. "And it's fascinating to learn about the game and everything you've figured out already. I'm glad you shared it with me, but that doesn't change the fact that we need to return the book." Emily couldn't do anything but blink at Mr. Quincy. How could he want to return the book after everything she had told him? How could he resist not knowing what lay at the end of Mr. Griswold's game? She almost felt tricked. But why? "I know who this book collector is, Mr. Remora. I've met him." Mr. Quincy raised his eyebrows, which must be the closest he ever came to looking shocked. "James and I took a tour of Bayside Press," Emily said by way of explanation. Now both of Mr. Quincy's eyebrows went up. "We ended up getting to go in Mr. Griswold's office. Mr. Romero was in there when he wasn't supposed to be. Later, we overheard him doing business at Hollis's bookstore, and he just wasn't very nice." "You might have caught him on a bad day," Mr. Quincy said. "You walk into dangerous territory when you make judgments against a person based on limited interaction." Emily couldn't believe Mr. Quincy was trusting the word of a man he didn't even know over hers. "Mr. Romero said he needs the book back for his job, but Mr. Griswold had already hidden it for the game. It wasn't supposed to be in Mr. Griswold's personal collection when I found it, so why would Mr. Romero be saying it should be?" "Do you know it wasn't supposed to be in his personal collection when you found it?" "Did you have confirmation of that? Or are you making an assumption?" "I don't have any proof, but—" "Did this Mr. Romero lie about Mr. Griswold being his client?" "Did this Mr. Romero lie about Mr. Griswold being his client?" Emily tugged at her backpack zipper. "No." "Did he lie about the gold bug belonging to his client?" "No." "So you haven't actually caught him in a lie." "What it sounds like you really want is a reason to keep the book for yourself, if only for a little while. I'm sorry, Emily. I really am. I understand where you're coming from. But some things are more important than games." The possibility that a man genuinely needs the book for his own job security trumps any game, no matter how intriguing. Are we clear on this, or do I need to call your parents? Emily swallowed. We're clear. Mr. Quinsley put the gold bug in his top drawer and returned to his grading. Their meeting was over, and on top of everything else, she hadn't even gotten help with the Maltese Falcon cipher. Emily left his room, fighting back tears. The hallways were filled with an assortment of costumed kids now that their first period bell was about to ring. Emily bumped against the skeleton's backpack. Sorry, she muttered. She turned corner after corner until she was in front of her locker. She spun the dial, tugged the door open, and ducked her head inside, under the pretense of sorting things into and out of her backpack. She wiped her nose and stared at the dark recesses where the gold bug had been. Later that day, Emily averted her eyes from Mr. Quinsley when she walked into social studies. He stood at the head of the classroom, as usual, arms crossed and occasionally nodding at students. Good afternoon, Emily, he said as she walked past. She kept her head down but bent her mouth into a smile of politeness' sake. She took her seat next to James, averting her eyes from him too. She caught him looking at her when she pulled her binder from her backpack. Maybe it was her imagination, or maybe it was the Cookie Monster hoodie sweatshirt he wore for Halloween, but she could have sworn he looked worried before he turned his attention back to his logic puzzles. She'd been using the back exit ever since the men chased her and James, but today that meant going through the crowds waiting for the haunted house in the cafeteria. She wasn't in the mood for any of that, and it had been 4 days since they'd seen those men. She doubted they were even still looking for her, especially since she posted on Book Scavenger that she didn't have the book, which ironically, Emily realized, was now true. So what did it even matter anymore? She craved a familiar face and decided to brave her regular route and stop by Hollister's. Before she pushed through the school's main entrance doors, Emily studied the idling vehicles in front. No sign of the old tan car. The afternoon was hot and the sun intense as she walked up the street. Emily shielded her eyes, but still the glaring rays managed to blend their way around her hand, dulling her sight. A metallic pounding grew louder as Emily approached Hollister's. She stepped over a thick hose draped across the sidewalk that ran from a truck parked at the curb to the inside of the building next to Hollister. The hose appeared to be connected to whatever was making the drilling noise inside. Hollister's door was propped open. Emily, who just moved here, Hollister shouted over the drilling when she entered. He stood at his counter, wearing purple robes and a wizard hat, topping off his dreads. He stepped out to close the shop door, which didn't totally silence the noise, but did make it bearable. Today's been a game of pick your poison, Hollister said. Suffer through the racket or work in an oven. That fan doesn't really cut it on a day like today. Hollister indicated a rotating fan that rattled in the corner. He returned to the book he had been wrapping in brown paper. No sidekick today? James had other plans. Emily shifted words around on the magnetic poetry tray on his counter, broken and cloud. Yeah, so what's new with you? You still enjoying Poe? Poe. Mr. Quinsley had probably talked to Mr. Romero on the phone at that very second to let him know Emily had returned the gold bug. Excuse me. To Hollister, she said, I carry the Poe book you gave me everywhere. Hollister pulled a piece of twine from a spindle attached to his counter, while Emily rearranged more magnetic letters. Hard, fool, magic. He held the paper folded around the book with one hand and the twine in the other, and looked for the pair of scissors lying near the book, to the twine, and then to Emily. "Do you mind?" he asked, nodding towards the twine. "Oh, sure." Emily picked up the scissors and leaned across the counter to clip the twine. She watched him wind it around the book and tie it in a neat knot. Presentation always makes a difference, don't you think? He held up the book to Emily, twisting it to show all sides. "You're really good at that," Emily said, thinking of the book sculpture Bayside Press emblem he'd taken down about a week ago to make his window display Halloween themed. Hollister pulled out a notebook from the shelf under his counter and flipped through the pages until he found the one he was looking for. He held the notebook out. "Can't read my own writing." Emily leaned forward. "It looks like 2634 Octopus to me," she read. "Probably Octavia Street." Hollister jotted down the address on a sticky note and placed it on the wrapped book. "Is that for Mr. Romero?" The question came with the memory of Hollister offering to deliver him a book the last time they were both in the bookstore. As soon as she asked the question, Emily realized she already knew the answer. Mr. Romero had complained to Hollister about living on Fillmore Street, near the Fillmore, which stuck in Emily's brain thanks to her brother. She even almost remembered his address. It was something repetitive with sevens, like 1717 or 7171 or 7711. Hollister studied her for a moment, his one tired eyelid dripping down as it always did. "How do you know Mr. Romero?" Emily reminded him of that day. "You told us he's a rare book specialist and Mr. Griswold is one of his clients." "I remember now. Yes, indeed, I did. And no, that isn't for him." An idea occurred to Emily. It wasn't a well thought out idea, and it probably wasn't a good idea, but Emily asked anyways. "Do you need help delivering your books? I could take that one you just wrapped, and if you have Mr. Romero's book ready, I could deliver that too." And then maybe when she delivered Mr. Romero's book, she could tell him that she was the student who found the gold bug and asked if she could borrow it back for a short period of time. Hollister adjusted his wizard hat. "Isn't that kind of you?" "Thank you, doll. But no, I cannot take you up on that offer. Too young to be my employee, for one, and even if that weren't the case, I wouldn't feel comfortable sending you around the city on your own to run my errands. Maybe if it was you and James together, but even then," Hollister shook his head. Hollister watched her push magnetic words. Salt, heart, weight. "You know, I appreciate my customers, and many of them are fine people. But not all book people are good people. Don't mistake shared interest with shared ethics." He tapped his pointy hat. "There's some wizardy wisdom for you today." Hollister stepped away from the counter and fiddled with the books on a nearby shelf, straightening some, pulling a title off of one shelf and moving it to the row below. His words made Emily think about Hollister's former friendship with Mr. Griswold. Both were book people. Both seemed like good people, and despite not having been friends for the last 30 years, Hollister had cared enough to dedicate his window display to Mr. Griswold in a time of need. "Hollister, have you talked to Mr. Griswold since he's been in the hospital?" If her question surprised him, Hollister didn't show. "I don't believe he's in a conversational state," is all he said, but the lines on his face sagged. There are people in the Book Scavenger website gossiping about him, she said. They don't think he's going to survive this attack. Emily wasn't sure if there was something she should have said, but she'd been carrying that worry in the back of her mind, and voicing it to someone who knew Garrison Griswold helped. I don't like thinking about it, she said. Hollister sighed. Negativity has never been a friend to anyone. What was he like when you two were friends? She asked. He finished his fussing and surveyed the store, almost like he was scanning the room for what task he could do next. Emily thought maybe he hadn't heard her question or was just going to ignore it because he didn't want to talk about Mr. Griswold. But then he said Gary was young, very creative, ambitious. We idolized the Beats. She looked at her, some of his dreadlocks swinging over her shoulder. You know the Beats. My dad's a huge fan. Good taste, Hollister nodded, his wizard cap at an angle. The person Gary and I looked up to the most was Lawrence Fingerletti. When we opened the bookstore, we fancied ourselves like him and Peter Martin when they started City Lights. We? This bookstore used to be Griswold's too? She envisioned Griswold walking out from the back with a box of books to shelve, greeting customers as the chimes signaled their entrance. Was it possible to feel nostalgic for something you hadn't experienced? This was before Bayside Press, of course. We were young. Too young to be part of the Beat movement, but old enough to be influenced by it. But also like Lawrence and Peter Martin, our partnership eventually severed. Ours less amicably, I'm afraid. Why? Similar interests, different priorities. That may not make sense. How two people can be passionate about the same thing and still find room for disagreement, but it happens. No, that actually makes a lot of sense, Emily said, thinking of her fight with James. Gary always had a grand plan, a way to make things bigger. My vision was to keep the bookstore small and a community place. Gary wanted to spread his energy and enthusiasm for the arts to as many people as he possibly could. Back then, I thought his generous spirit had turned greedy, and we had a falling out. Over time, I realized that even though the money and success came to him eventually, it was never his motive. Money changes your circumstances, but it can't change your core. A spiteful person became a spiteful person with money. A kind person with money. James and I had a fight. Emily concentrated on lining the magnets into a row rather than seeing Hollister's reaction to her confession. That's bound to happen, even with the best of friends. I don't think. The drilling next door reverberated dully through the share wall. Emily took a deep breath. I don't know how to be a good friend. Hollister blew a raspberry. Nonsense. There's no how about it. Just be. Just do. That's all a good friend is. That's what Gary did for me. He reached out for years, but I didn't appreciate it at first, and James might not either. But if your intentions are good and the friendship was true to begin with, he'll come around. The mechanical pounding stopped suddenly, making the silence feel stark. The magnetic words scraped on the tray as Emily pushed them, absorbing what Hollister had said. Bird, whisper, shadow. Okay, we will continue this after we get back from winter break. You guys have a great time.